Before we start, there is something history never tells you about the men who built America's most powerful drug empires. The ones you know, the ones with the documentaries, the movies, the rap songs with their names in the lyrics. Those men wanted to be seen. The DeLorean, the Dapper Dan, the Rolls Royce, the diamonds, all of it was a performance. And while the world was watching the performance, the real power was somewhere else, standing on a corner looking like nobody, driving a car nobody would look twice at, living at an address that even the men working for him didn't know. These men were not famous, not celebrated, not in the movies or the songs. They were shadows. And from those shadows, they supplied entire cities. They built empires that the government spent years trying to find because the man at the center was invisible by design. This compilation is about those men, the hidden kings, the operators who understood something the flashy ones never figured out. Attention is a target, invisibility is armor, and the most dangerous man in any city is the one nobody can find. We start in Queens, New York. Number 1, James the Ghost Corley. The 40 Projects, South Jamaica, Queens. South Jamaica, Queens. 1987, 23 acres of squat, 3-story buildings near 160th Street and 107th Avenue. The South Jamaica houses, the 40 Projects, ground zero of New York's crack epidemic, where the Supreme Team was born, where Fat Cat ran his operation out of Big Mac's Deli, where $200,000 moved every single day. Every name in the 40 Projects had a face attached to it. A block, a car, an address, except one family, the Corley family, James Wall Corley, his brothers Darnell and Irvin, and their mother, Sadie Corley, a woman the Daily News would eventually refer to in print as Mama Crack. A woman authorities said was in the narcotics business herself. The Corley family was royalty in the 40 Projects. James Wall was the landlord, not a tenant, not just another operator, the landlord. And while every other name in Queens had a face, Wall had a nickname the police gave him, the Ghost, 1988. The New York Police Department unleashed something unprecedented on South Jamaica. The Tactical Narcotics Team, TNT, Mayor Ed Koch's #1 priority, $32.9 million that year. A direct response to the execution-style murder of rookie officer Edward Byrne, shot dead in his patrol car on March 26, 1988, while guarding a witness. TNT came for the 4 biggest names in Southeast Queens. Supreme Team, taken down November 24, 1987. Tony Montana Mickens, empire broken up May 10, 1988. Fat Cat Nichols and Pappy Mason, taken down August 11, 1988. 3 down. The Daily News ran an article on October 26, 1988. A newly appointed narcotics unit commander said it plainly. We took down the Supreme Team, then Tony Montana, then Fat Cat, now Corley, the last of the Gang of 4. James Wall Corley, arrested in 1988, was running a $5 million per year operation, $13 million in today's money. But here is the detail that defined everything that came next. Corley did not get the Kingpin charge. Supreme McGriff, life without parole. Fat Cat, 40 years. Pappy Mason, life without parole. Corley walked out and disappeared. 24 years. That is how long Wall Corley operated after the first 3 fell. The detectives who spent careers in Southeast Queens describe him in one specific way. He was the one that got away, not because the government did not try, because Corley had built something around himself that had no precedent in Queens street history. Nobody knew where he lived. Nobody knew what phone number he used. Nobody knew what car he drove. Those words did not come from the streets. They came from the police commissioner of New York City. Raymond Kelly, standing at a press conference in 2012, described a drug dealer in language police commissioners almost never use. He had an uncanny ability to keep his associates in the dark. No one knew where he lived, what phone number he used, what car he drove. His own associates did not know his address. The men inside his operation daily did not know where he slept, and the system went deeper. 8 phones, simultaneously, rotating constantly. By the time law enforcement identified a number and confirmed a tap, he had already moved to the next one, and his communications were in a secret language, the 5% code. Every number, every letter of the alphabet, each one assigned its own specific word. Drug orders, locations, product quantities, all transmitted in code that required knowing the full system before a single message made sense. Detective David Leonardi, the lead investigator, spent months on wiretaps before he could even read what was being said. By the time they cracked the language, Corley had burned that phone. 8 phones, a secret language, an unknown address, an unknown car, and one more layer. Corley was a member of the 7 Crowns, the Queens gang that consisted of the borough's biggest drug traffickers, the invisible council that operated above everything visible, the structure that outlasted every organization that anyone outside knew about. Wall was not just a dealer who survived. He was part of the hidden architecture beneath everything. Some people online believe that Ghost, the character from the hit series Power, the New York drug kingpin who operates a legitimate nightclub while running a cocaine empire in complete secrecy, was modeled on James Wall Corley. Nobody has confirmed it, nobody has denied it, but the comparison tells you everything about what Corley represented. A man so invisible that a fictional television character may have been built on his disappearing act. 2012, Operation Southside, 15 months undercover. The 5% code finally cracked. 44 co-defendants arrested simultaneously, and Raymond Kelly at a podium finally naming what Queens had known for 24 years. The Ghost, James Wall Corley, 51 years old, still in the 40 projects, still operating, still invisible. Supreme McGriff, life without parole, gone. Fat Cat, 40 years, gone. Pappy Mason, life without parole, gone. Tony Montana, gone. Wall Corley, still there, until he wasn't. The landlord of the 40 projects, the ghost of Queens. Harlem, 112th Street, 1989. A man is standing on a corner, ashy knuckles, no haircut, dressed like he just came back from the laundromat. Nobody looks at him twice. Around him, Dapper Dan, foreign cars, men whose jewelry announces what they are before they open their mouths, BMWs pulling up, the whole block turning to watch. He doesn't turn. He just watches. Calm, still, the way a man watches something that belongs to him. Because it does. All of it. Every kilo moving through Harlem. Every operator building a corner. Every kingpin pulling up in a car that cost more than most people in this neighborhood will make in 10 years. Connected to this man that nobody is looking at. 1,600 kilos every month. All 5 boroughs, the Medellin cartel on one end, Harlem on the other, and this man, ashy knuckles, no haircut, dressed like nobody, standing in the middle of it. The streets called him Fritz. And the day he almost lost everything was not the day they shot him 5 times on this same block. Not the afternoon Alpo Martinez walked into a room surrounded by shooters and was told, very quietly, that he might not be walking back out. It was an ordinary day. A parking lot. A car that looked abandoned. a trunk, and nearly $1 million that two police officers found and decided to keep. Richard Fritz Simmons was born in Charleston, South Carolina in the late 1950s. His nickname came from a 1970s animated film called Fritz the Cat, the specific detail that tells you something about who he was in Harlem before the money arrived. A boy with a personality vivid enough to earn a name from a movie. Someone people noticed before he had anything to offer them. As a young kid, Fritz visited his father in Harlem during summer months. The city pulled at him the way it pulls at everyone who grows up visiting it from somewhere smaller. By junior high school, he made the decision permanent. He moved to Harlem with his sister Evelyn. St. Nick Projects, 112th Street. He arrived with nothing. He left with everything, but not before building everything from scratch. In junior high, Fritz noticed something. He went to parties, and the people throwing those parties were making money from the people attending. He had an idea. He could throw parties too. Fritz and his friends Rob, Curtis, and Danny started throwing parties at the St. Nick Community Center. They made a few $100s the first night. Good money for teenagers in the 1970s. The party hustle worked until it didn't. At one of his parties, a gun was drawn. Fritz was hit in the head with the weapon. When he regained consciousness, he beat the man who had hit him so badly that the police were called. Fritz spent a few days on Rikers Island. He came out calmer than he went in, because Fritz understood something from that incident that most men in his position didn't understand. Violence was useful, but it was also expensive. It attracted attention. It created consequences, and consequences were the one thing that a man building something real could not afford. He filed that lesson away. The Queen Bee. By the late 1970s, Fritz and his sister Evelyn moved from St. Nick Projects to 112th Street. That move changed everything. Another resident of that building was a woman that Harlem knew by one name, the Queen Bee, Joan Moreland, the first black woman to purchase kilos of heroin directly from the Lucchese crime family, not buying from an intermediary who bought from the Lucchese's directly. Walking into rooms with Italian organized crime figures and negotiating prices and quantities the way that men twice her size and decades older struggled to do. Some people in Harlem said she was larger than Nicky Barnes. Nicky Barnes, the man whose face was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. The man whose notoriety triggered a personal order from President Jimmy Carter to dismantle his operation. The most famous Harlem drug figure of his era. Some said Joan Moreland was bigger. Fritz met her through her nephew, whom Fritz began helping to sell heroin. The Queen Bee saw something in the young man from Charleston immediately. She took him under her wing, made him her mentee. And Fritz, who had been absorbing lessons his entire life, who had come to Harlem specifically to learn what the city had to teach, absorbed everything she knew. Then he applied it. He was working with a friend on the block when he had an idea that nobody had tried before. Give the heroin away, free, just for a day, just to attract customers, just to let people know that what they were selling was real, was the best, was worth coming back for. Less than a few hours later, 100 to 112th Street had customers lined up that had never been there before. The line doubled, then tripled. Within days, their weekly profit went from $10,000 to over $60,000. As teenagers, in the late 1970s, $60,000 per week before Fritz was 20 years old. Other dealers on the block watched what Fritz was doing. They grew respect for him the way you grow respect for someone who outworks and outthinks everyone around them. Then they joined him. Fritz was moving so fast, he outgrew the Queen Bee and her connect. She introduced him to a new one, This connect gave Fritz bad product, deliberately cutting the quality to keep him in debt, to keep him dependent, to prevent a young man who was clearly going to become something enormous from becoming it too fast. Fritz recognized the play immediately. He told the Connect, "Once I pay you, our business is done." The Connect sent shooters. Fritz was shot 5 times on 112th Street. He survived hours of surgery, numerous blood transfusions, and was relocated to his mother's house in South Carolina to recover. He came back. When Fritz returned to Harlem, he came back different. Not broken, not cautious in the way that surviving a shooting makes most men cautious, focused. He had contacts now that operated on a different level from anything the Queen Bee had introduced him to. He was being supplied directly from the Medellin cartel, the most powerful cocaine organization on earth. Pablo Escobar's organization, the source that everyone in New York's drug trade was downstream from, filtered through layers of intermediaries who each took their percentage and added their markup. Fritz went to the source. $6,000 profit per key to start. He gave it all away on consignment, not because he was generous in the naive sense, because Fritz understood an economic truth that most operators in his position never grasped. The richest man in any market is not the man who holds the most product. It is the man who moves the most product. And the man who moves the most product is the man who has the most operators working beneath him, each of them selling, each of them generating returns, each of them coming back because the product is the best and the prices are fair and the arrangement is one that creates millionaires. Fritz was creating bosses. That was his specific genius. He started operators small, a few keys on consignment, enough to build a customer base, enough to prove they could move it and pay him back reliably. Once they proved themselves, he scaled them up. Multiple kilos, more consignment, more trust. If they failed, if they ran off, if they spent the money, if they couldn't pay, he had an enforcer named Chuck. Chuck didn't kill people for delinquent payments. Fritz understood that killing brought attention, and attention brought law enforcement, and law enforcement was the one variable no operation could survive indefinitely. Chuck sent messages. A visit from Chuck was usually all that was needed. The word that Fritz gave on credit, that his product was 99.9% pure, that you could stretch it and still have the best product on your block, spread through all 5 boroughs the way that quality always spreads. All 5 boroughs: Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, Manhattan, Harlem, Spanish Harlem, the Dominicans in Washington Heights. Every major player in New York City's drug trade in the 1980s was connected to Fritz. 1,600 keys per month. The Membersonly account described it with a specific reverence. He made more millionaires than Lotto. And here is the detail that captures everything about who Fritz was. Men were standing on the block with Fritz standing right there in front of them, moving his product, not knowing that the product they were moving was his. They didn't know he was the plug. He dressed regular, ashy knuckles, no haircut, no jewelry, no car that announced what he was. The most powerful drug figure in Harlem looked like he was one of the workers. That was intentional. He never allowed flashy cars on 112th Street. If you came to do business, park the flashy car somewhere else. Don't bring that type of noise on his block. The book, The Harlem Plug, described him precisely. A one-man syndicate, no partners, no gang ties, well protected because of his association with the Colombian cartel. One man, 1,600 keys per month, supplying all 5 boroughs. In 1985, Fritz opened a nightclub, the Uptown Garage, 127th Street and Convent Avenue. it became the hottest spot in the city. Young hustlers pulled up in what witnesses described as spaceships, BMWs, Mercedes, Porsches. The interiors, designed by Dapper Dan, the Harlem designer who was putting MCM, Gucci, and Louis Vuitton on the interiors of cars when the legitimate fashion world was still refusing to license their logos to black customers. If it was foreign, young kids in Harlem were pulling up in it. One well-known Brooklyn hustler said, when he went to Harlem, it was like a movie. Among the men in that world, among the operators that Fritz had created and elevated, was a young man from Harlem whose name would eventually become inseparable from what that era produced. Richard Porter. Rich Porter. Fritz supplied Rich Porter, not as a charity case, not as a protege in the mentor sense, as one of the operators in the network that Fritz had built, a man who had proved himself capable of moving volume, of paying reliably, of building his own customer base on the foundation that Fritz's product made possible. Fritz didn't create Rich Porter's ambition or his personality or the specific charisma that made Harlem love him, but he created the conditions that made Rich Porter possible. Without Fritz, there is no Harlem cocaine economy at that scale. Without Fritz, there is no Rich Porter at that level. Without Fritz, there is no Paid in Full. The story that the world knows, the movie, the mythology, the specific Harlem 1980s narrative that has been told and retold for 30 years, starts with Fritz. December 1989, Rich Porter's 12-year-old brother Donald is kidnapped on his way to school. Harlem stops. Rich goes to Fritz, his connect, his supplier, the man who had built the network that made Rich's operation possible. Fritz didn't hesitate. He gave Rich a Louis Vuitton bag, inside close to $200,000 in cash, and 30 keys of cocaine. A gift. Free. Nothing owed. Nothing expected in return. The street value of 30 keys in 1989 was approximately $690,000. Fritz gave Rich close to $900,000 worth of money and product as a gift and told him one thing: get your brother back and get out of the game. He saw what was coming. He understood the heat that the kidnapping of a 12-year-old child was going to bring to Harlem, the law enforcement pressure, the media attention, the specific kind of scrutiny that destroyed operations that had survived everything else. He told Rich to take the money and disappear. Rich took the bag, but he didn't disappear. He gave the 30 keys to Alpo. Alpo sold them in D.C. When Fritz found out, he set up a meeting, 131st Street, Madison Avenue, the east side of Harlem. Alpo arrived. He didn't know what was waiting for him. Fritz, his top earner ace, and numerous shooters placed outside around the store and the block. The order was specific. If Fritz does not walk out of that store, Alpo and everyone he came with do not walk out of that store. The conversation inside was heated. Alpo said the words that told Fritz everything he needed to know about who Alberto Martinez actually was. Dead men can't pay. Referring to Rich, Fritz didn't like Alpo's flashy character, had never trusted it, had specifically refused to do business with him, because a man who needed to be seen was a man who couldn't be controlled. He let Alpo walk out, because dead men can't pay. And Alpo owed him, but he never did business with Alpo Martinez again. It was an opportunity Alpo missed. The same period, the same informant who would eventually lead cops to Fritz's car was moving through Harlem's underground like a ghost. Nobody knew who he was, but he was connected to everyone. Fritz, Rich Porter, the major players whose operations were built on top of each other like floors in a building, each one dependent on the ones below. The informant knew the patterns. Fritz switched cars constantly, played his rearview mirrors, circled blocks, took different routes every time. He was the most surveillance-conscious operator in Harlem, a man who had built 1,600 keys per month, in part by being impossible to follow. But the informant did not need to follow him. He knew the parking lot. He knew the car. He knew the money would be there. The cops arrived before Fritz could react. They asked for the keys. He gave them. They opened the trunk. $1 million. The officers did not log the evidence. They took the money. They gave Fritz his car keys back and left him standing in the parking lot in Harlem with nothing. Fritz smirked, stayed calm, memorized their faces. He had cops on payroll. His mind was already working through who these officers were and what his own network of law enforcement contacts could tell him about them. The loss did not break him, did not flinch, did not panic, did not cooperate, because nearly $1 million for the man receiving 1,600 keys per month from the Medellin cartel was a loss he could absorb. What he could not absorb was the knowledge that someone close to him had made it happen. Connect the dots, Membersonly said it directly. Fritz loses almost $1 million to dirty cops. A couple weeks later, Rich Porter is stopped by police. $80,000 and his car taken. Same informant, same period, same network being systematically robbed. The cops were not the only criminals in Harlem in 1989, 1991. Fritz was planning to exit. Real estate. The building he had bought on 119th Street. The properties he had been acquiring. Legitimate assets built from the money that 1,600 keys per month generates when a man is disciplined enough to convert it into something that outlasts the game. He went to prison. 3 months later, his enforcer Chuck was murdered. 3 months after that, Fritz became ill, losing weight, in and out of the hospital. The specific deterioration that Harlem watched with the specific grief that communities reserve for men who have taken care of them. Because Fritz had done that. He paid rent for people, covered college tuition, gave money to help people start businesses, helped them purchase homes. He threw thousands of dollars out the window on 112th Street in the final months, as if he could feel what was coming, and the money did not matter anymore because he still had millions, and the time to spend it was running out. The Colombian cartel member came to the hospital, not as a business associate, as a friend. He sat beside Fritz and wished him a speedy recovery. Fritz passed away from an unknown blood poison, not AIDS, as Harlem rumored. And then the final betrayal. The millions he had made, stolen by trusted members of his inner circle after he died. The properties he had bought, taken. His family, left with nothing. The money he had specifically set aside for them never reached them. Fritz built an empire that made more millionaires than Lotto. He created the conditions that produced Rich Porter and Azier Faison and every other operator in Harlem's most famous era. He refused to do business with Alpo Martinez, the man whose violence eventually destroyed everything Fritz had built. He survived 5 gunshot wounds, a $1 million theft by dirty cops, and the kidnapping crisis that unraveled Harlem's most famous operator. And he died with nothing. Because the people he trusted most, the people he had made rich, took everything after he was gone. That is the story of Richard Fritz Simmons, the consignment king, the man who created Rich Porter's world, the man history forgot while celebrating everyone he made. Subscribe to Bloody Reports. There are 1,000 stories like this one that nobody has told the right way yet. This was one of them. South Jamaica, Queens. Sometime in the late 1970s, a man is walking down 150th Street. He has long straightened hair, pale light brown skin, a reddish birthmark just above his mouth. He moves through the block the way a man moves when he knows exactly what he is and has nothing to prove. The moment he turns onto the strip, something happens. Young hustlers start calling out, one voice first, then another, then the whole block rippling with it. Hey, hey, Ronnie's over here, they're paying homage, to a man who doesn't even slow down to acknowledge it. Because here is the thing about Ronald Bassett, the man who would eventually be known across all 5 boroughs as Ronnie Bumps. He didn't care about being known, he cared about one thing, the cash. That specific quality, that particular indifference to the street fame that every man around him was desperate to accumulate, is what made him one of the most extraordinary operators South Jamaica Queens ever produced. And here is what South Jamaica Queens will never fully admit. Without that man walking down 150th Street, without that man who looked exactly like Ron O'Neal playing Priest in Superfly, there is no Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols. There is no Kenneth Supreme McGriff. There is no Supreme Team generating $200,000 per day. The entire mythology of Queens drug royalty that 50 Cent would eventually put on wax, the names and stories that defined the borough's underground economy for a generation, traces back to one man, a man who didn't even want his name in the song. This is the story of Ronnie Bumps Bassett, the architect of Queens. Before Bumps, there was Pops, John Freeman, the man Queens called Pops Freeman. In the 1960s and early 70s, when Queens' drug trade was being established, when the specific geography of South Jamaica and Hollis and the corridors that would eventually produce one of the most dangerous underground economies in New York City history was being mapped, Pops Freeman was the man who ran it, not alone. With connections, Pops Freeman had established deep ties with the Genovese family, one of New York's 5 Italian organized crime families, the organization that would eventually be described by the FBI as the most powerful and sophisticated of all 5. In the 60s, according to rumor that circulated through Queens street world, Pops had actually been set up in business by Vito Genovese himself, the Italian mob. In Queens, feeding a black operation. That arrangement was not generosity, it was business. The Italians controlled the heroin supply chain in the 1960s through their connections to the Sicilian Mafia and the French Connection pipeline. If you wanted to run a significant drug operation in New York, you needed their product, which meant you needed their permission, which meant you paid them their percentage and operated at a level they approved. Pops Freeman operated within that structure for years, built something real, built something that Queens respected. But by the late 1970s, Pops Freeman was aging out. The game had changed around him. New men had emerged. New money was moving. And the structure he had built, the network, the connections, the specific organizational architecture that made Queens' drug trade function, needed new leadership. Pops Freeman looked at the men around him. He chose Ronald Bassett, not as a junior partner, not as an employee being promoted. As a successor, he handed Bumps the entire operation, the network, the connections, the Italian mob pipeline that had been the foundation of Queens' drug trade since the 60s. Everything around 1979. And what Bumps did with that inheritance, how he transformed what Pops Freeman had built into something none of them had imagined, is the story that Queens never told properly. Here is the move that nobody in Queens fully understood when Bumps made it. He cut the Italians off, not gradually, not partially, not while maintaining the relationship as a backup option. Completely. A black man from Hollis, Queens, who had just inherited the most significant drug operation in the borough, looked at the Italian mob pipeline that had been the foundation of everything Pops Freeman built, and decided he did not need it. Think about what that decision required. The Italian mob in the late 1970s was not an organization you walked away from over a business disagreement. These were the men who had structured New York's entire drug trade for decades, who had the supply chain, who had the violence infrastructure, who had demonstrated repeatedly and publicly what happened to people who decided they were done paying the percentage. Bumps saw something they did not see. The cocaine era was arriving. The heroin pipelines that the Italian mob had controlled for decades were becoming less critical as Colombian cocaine began flooding American cities. New supply chains were being established. Direct relationships between American operators and Colombian suppliers, cutting out every layer of Italian middleman, were suddenly possible in ways they had not been before. Bumps moved. He went direct to Colombian suppliers, not through the Italians, not through anyone else's relationship, his own direct line. The move did what all great strategic decisions do. It changed his price. When you buy through a middleman, you pay for the middleman, their margin, their risk, their infrastructure. The Italians were not fronting product out of generosity. Every kilo that moved through their pipeline generated revenue for them. When Bumps went direct, the Colombian's price came straight to him. His product was better, his prices were lower, his margins were larger. And because his margins were larger, he could do something that separated him from almost every other operator in Queens. He could build people up, not just move product. He could build an entire ecosystem of operators underneath him who could generate revenue he shared in, while the product he controlled kept flowing through their operations. The architect was building the city. By the early 1980s, Ronnie Bumps Bassett was running something that the Queen Street world had never seen before. More than 100 employees, numbers and drug rackets operating out of at least 9 separate outlets spread across Queens. 100 people, 9 locations. One man's organizational architecture holding it all together. The Queens hustler who was quoted about Bumps in the book Queens Reigns Supreme, Ethan Brown's definitive account of South Jamaica's drug royalty, said something that has stuck to Bumps's name ever since. Nicky Barnes was more flamboyant. But Ronnie was big. Ronnie was up there. Nicky Barnes, the man whose face went on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. The man whose notoriety triggered a personal order from President Jimmy Carter to destroy his operation. The most famous Harlem drug figure of his era. That, Nicky Barnes. Queens said Bumps was comparable. Not famous, not flamboyant, not the kind of man whose jewelry announced his arrival or whose cars made the neighborhood stop and stare. Comparable to Nicky Barnes in the thing that actually mattered, the operation. Federal agents who eventually tracked Bumps's activities documented something that tells the whole story without requiring any interpretation. In one 9-week period, just 9 weeks, Bumps imported $1.2 million worth of uncut heroin via Baltimore. $1.2 million in 9 weeks. Uncut. The federal agents watching him were tracking one slice of his operation. One city in a network that stretched to Detroit and Philadelphia. One 9-week window out of years of operation. That is who Ronnie Bumps Bassett was. And the whole time, young hustlers were crying out, "Hey, hey, Ronnie's over here on 150th Street." And Bumps was walking right through them, strictly about the cash. There is a teenager in this story. He grew up across the street from the Baisley projects. Both his parents worked for the Transit Authority. They wanted him to go to college. They had a future mapped out for him that had nothing to do with South Jamaica's underground economy. His name was Kenneth McGriff. By the time Kenneth McGriff was old enough to be in the streets of South Jamaica, the streets of South Jamaica were Ronnie Bumps Bassett's streets, his organization, his product, his rules. Young Kenneth McGriff started his drug career doing the most junior job in any drug operation, guarding Bumps' stash houses, standing outside a building where Bumps' product was stored, watching, waiting, learning. What he was learning, what every hour spent in the orbit of Bumps' operation was teaching him, was organizational intelligence. How a 100-person operation maintains discipline. How product moves through 9 outlets without creating chaos. How a man builds something that generates $1.2 million in 9 weeks while walking down a block so quietly that the people working for him don't even know his name. The boy guarding the stash house was absorbing everything, and he was not alone. Lorenzo Nichols, the man who would eventually run his headquarters out of Big Mac's Deli in Jamaica, who would run one of the most violent drug organizations in New York City history, who would order hits from inside a prison cell, was also in that world, hanging around, learning, absorbing. The young hustlers who would eventually define Queen's drug mythology were doing their apprenticeships in Ronnie Bumps Bassett's operation. They would become legends. Bumps would become a footnote. That is not because Bumps was smaller than them. It is because Bumps made sure he was invisible. Federal pressure arrived. The indictment came out of Baltimore, the same corridor that Bumps had used to move $1.2 million in 9 weeks. The federal government had been watching, building their case, following the money and the product through the specific geography of Bumps' multi-city network. The heat forced him out, and when Bumps stepped back, he did something that tells you everything about the kind of man he was. He didn't let the operation collapse. He handed it off. Just as Pops Freeman had once looked at the men around him and chosen Ronald Bassett, Bumps looked at the men around him and chose Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols. He gave Nichols the Colombian connection, the direct line that Bumps had built by cutting the Italians out, the specific business relationship that had made Bumps' operation generate $1.2 million in 9 weeks passed from Bumps to Fat Cat. Intact. The pipeline stayed open. The product kept moving. And Fat Cat, who had the Colombian connection Bumps had built, who had the organizational knowledge he had absorbed watching Bumps operate, built his own legend on the foundation Bumps had laid. His headquarters was Big Mac's Deli. His crew included Howard Pappy Mason. His organization would eventually order the murder of rookie NYPD officer Edward Byrne, a murder that triggered the largest anti-drug operation in New York City history. Fat Cat became everything Queens remembered. Bumps became the name in the fine print. And Supreme McGriff, the boy who had started his career guarding Bumps' stash houses, took what he had learned and built the Supreme Team, $200,000 per day at their 1987 peak. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole when the government finally finished building its case against him. The Supreme Team became hip-hop mythology. 50 Cent built his entire early career partly on the specific gravity of their story. Ghetto Quran, Ja Rule, Murder Inc. The specific ecosystem that produced one of the most important moments in hip-hop history ran through the Supreme Team, which ran through Fat Cat, which ran through Bumps. In 2002, Curtis Jackson, the rapper who called himself 50 Cent, released a mixtape track called Ghetto Quran. The song was a tribute to the Queens street legends who had shaped the borough that produced him. It named names: Fat Cat, Supreme, Prince, Tony Montana, and one name that most listeners did not recognize: Ronnie Bumps. 50 Cent knew who built the foundation. He grew up in South Jamaica knowing the same oral history that every South Jamaica street kid absorbed. The lineage from Pops Freeman to Bumps to Fat Cat to Supreme. He put Bumps in the verse, not as the main character, not as the headline, as the reference that told the initiated listener something important. That the men who became famous were standing on someone else's shoulders. That the architect of Queen's entire underground mythology was a man who walked through his own operation like a ghost, visible to everyone, known to the young hustlers on 150th Street, but invisible to the world outside that geography. Strictly about the cash, never about the fame. December 2009. Ronnie Bumps Bassett is not a young man anymore. The era that produced him, the South Jamaica Queens of the late 1970s and early 1980s, the world of Pops Freeman and Italian mob pipelines and Colombian direct connections, is 30 years in the past. Fat Cat is serving 40 years. Supreme McGriff is serving life without the possibility of parole. The men who built on Bumps's foundation were swallowed by the federal system that eventually comes for everyone who stays in the game long enough. Bumps should have been finished, should have been the old man who had stepped back, who had passed the torch, who had done his time and found his way to something else. But the DEA was listening to a phone, and on that phone, Ronnie Bumps Bassett's voice, still in it. Federal agents had tapped his line and documented his involvement in a heroin distribution conspiracy involving approximately 20 other individuals. 7 kilograms of heroin seized, nearly $500,000 in cash. At his sentencing, the federal government translated 30 years of operation into a single number, 210 months, 17 and a half years. At an age when most men from his era were either dead or done, Ronnie Bumps Bassett received a sentence that would take him deep into old age. The fine the government attached was almost insulting in its smallness. $17,500, $1,000 for every year of the sentence. For a man who had imported $1.2 million of uncut heroin in 9 weeks. For the man who had built the organization that trained Fat Cat and Supreme and the entire generation of Queens drug royalty that followed. The government's accounting didn't capture what Bumps actually cost them, what Bumps actually cost the streets, what Bumps actually built. South Jamaica, Queens. Today, the names people remember are the names of the men who were loud: Fat Cat, Supreme, Prince, Tony Montana, the men who ran their organizations visibly, who made their presence felt, who generated the kind of stories, the violence, the court cases, the FBI surveillance, the hip-hop connections that become mythology. Those men are in books, in documentaries, in rap songs. The man who built them, the man who trained them, who gave Fat Cat the Colombian connection, who created the organizational environment that young Kenneth McGriff learned to be the supreme team in, walks through history like he walked through 150th Street. Like a ghost. Hey, Ronnie's over here. And Bumps kept walking. He didn't want the credit, didn't want the fame, didn't want the kind of visibility that turns a man into a target for rivals, for law enforcement, for the federal indictments that eventually arrive for everyone who announces themselves. He wanted the cash. He got it. He also got 17 and a half years in his old age, because the streets have a specific memory. They remember the men who built them even when history doesn't. The DEA remembered Ronnie Bumps Bassett in 2009 because the men who study criminal organizations understand something that the mythology around Fat Cat and Supreme never fully captured. Before there was a Supreme team, before there was Fat Cat's empire, before any of it, There was a man from Hollis who looked like the guy from Superfly, who walked down 150th Street while young hustlers paid homage to him, who cut the Italian mob out of Queens' drug trade and went direct to Colombia, who trained Kenneth McGriff, who gave Fat Cat the Connect, who built the foundation that an entire generation of Queen Street legends built their mythologies on, and who never, not once, asked for the credit. That is Ronnie Bumps Bassett, the man Queens forgot, the man without whom Queens as we know it never exists. Subscribe to Bloody Reports. There are 1,000 stories like this one that nobody... August 27th, 2012, Harlem, New York. A horse-drawn carriage rolls slowly down Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard. No rush, no sirens, just the clop of hooves on asphalt and a crowd that stretches back 3 city blocks. Inside that carriage, an ornate casket. Inside that casket, a man in an impeccable suit. He left the way he lived, on his own terms, in style. Lil' Kim was there. Cameron was there. Music executives, street legends, old school OGs who hadn't left Harlem in decades, they were all there. And then he walked in. Sean Combs, Puff Daddy, Diddy, whatever name he was going by that week. He stood at the microphone. He said a few words. He called this man his uncle. He said this man had saved his life. Then he left, got into his car, and according to people who were there, he never looked back. Here's what Diddy didn't say at that funeral. He didn't say that Eric Von Zip Martin had been quietly erased from his public story for years. His name appeared nowhere on any Wikipedia page, any official biography, or any press release from Bad Boy Entertainment. He didn't say that years before that funeral, LAPD detectives had flown to New York specifically to build a case connecting this man to the most famous unsolved murder in hip-hop history. He didn't say that, according to a Southside Crips shot caller, who would later be indicted for murder, Von Zip Martin may have supplied the weapon that killed Tupac Shakur. And he definitely didn't say the part that made investigators' blood run cold. Von Zip was present at both crime scenes. The night Tupac got shot in Vegas, Von Zip was there. The night Biggie got killed in Los Angeles, Von Zip was there. 2 of the greatest rappers who ever lived. 2 of the most infamous murders in American music history. One man, present at both, and he died of cancer in 2012. His secrets, according to someone who knew him well, died with him. This is the story of a man who ran Harlem for decades, who moved between the streets and the suites like he was born for both, who sat at the table with Bumpy Johnson, Frank Lucas, Mike Tyson, Diddy, and Biggie, and made sure every deal got done. The man they called Von Zip, the man who may have held a piece of the biggest secret in hip-hop, the man nobody was supposed to know about. You have to understand Harlem in the 1960s to understand Von Zip. 118th Street between 8th Avenue and St. Nicholas. That is where Eric Martin was born. That is where he grew up. And for a black kid in Harlem in that era, the street was not just an address. It was a classroom. Harlem in the 1960s was the epicenter of Black America. The music, the culture, the politics. Malcolm X was preaching blocks away. The Apollo was the church of rhythm and blues, and underneath all of it, running parallel to that beauty, was an economy that the rest of America refused to see. Numbers running, policy rackets, and by the time young Eric Martin had eyes to see it, the heroin trade. The man who ran that world was not a faceless corporation. He had a name, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the godfather of Harlem. The man who had faced down the Italian mob in the 1930s, brokered peace with Lucky Luciano, and kept Harlem's black underground economy out of white hands for 4 decades. Bumpy died in 1968 of a heart attack. He collapsed at Wells' restaurant, a cup of coffee in his hand and a chicken leg on the plate in front of him. The throne was empty. What happened next would define the next 30 years of Harlem's underworld. Frank Lucas moved in, claiming Bumpy's crown, building his blue magic empire, importing heroin directly from Southeast Asia, and putting Harlem on a different kind of map. And somewhere in that chaos, in that power vacuum, a young man from 118th Street was watching, learning, positioning. Eric Martin, who the streets would come to call Von Zip, understood something that most of the men around him did not. Power was not just about who moved the most product. Power was about who you knew. And Von Zip decided to know everybody. Call it a gift. Call it survival instinct. Call it genius. Whatever you call it, Von Zip had an ability that very few men in his world possessed. He could sit down with anyone. It did not matter if you were a street soldier from Harlem or a record executive from Midtown. It did not matter if you ran a Crip set in Compton or an Italian social club in Brooklyn. Von Zip moved through all of those worlds with the same ease, the same mink coat, the same pork pie hat, the same steady eyes that told you he was not scared of you, and he did not need anything from you that he could not get somewhere else. By the 1970s, he had built what investigators would later describe as a supply network that stretched from coast to coast. On the West Coast, the South Side Crips, based out of Compton, California, were one of the most powerful and dangerous street organizations in Los Angeles history. They moved product, they had muscle, and they needed markets on the East Coast. Von Zip gave them Harlem. According to multiple sources, including law enforcement reports, Zip operated a supply relationship with the South Side Crips for close to a decade. They sent supply west to east. He handled distribution. It was business, and it was very, very profitable. But here is what separated Von Zip from every other distributor in Harlem. He understood that the real power was not in the product. The real power was in the relationship. Anyone can move supply. Not everyone can sit at the same table with Frank Lucas, then walk across the street and have a conversation with someone Frank Lucas would never speak to. Not everyone can be the man in the middle. Von Zip was the man in the middle. And in the world he operated in, that was the most dangerous, most powerful, most lucrative position you could hold. By the 1980s, something was changing in Harlem. The music was changing too. A new sound was coming up out of the South Bronx and making its way downtown. Hip-hop, rap music. A generation of young black men and women had grown up watching the old Kingpins, the Bumpies, the Lucases, the Bobs and the Flashes, and decided to turn that lifestyle into art. Von Zip saw it coming before most people in his world did. He started moving, not away from the streets, but alongside something new. He owned clubs, Harlem Lounge, and later Zip Code, a nightclub on Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard that became one of the most important rooms in New York, not just because of the music they played, but because of who came through the door. Everybody came to Zip Code. Street legends, music executives, athletes, politicians, and rappers who were about to become superstars. And through those doors, Von Zip became the bridge between two worlds most people thought were separate. They were not separate. They never were. There was a young music executive making noise in New York in the early 1990s, building a record label, hustling his way into boardrooms and studio sessions. His name was Sean Combs, and Sean Combs did not have the connections he needed, not yet. Von Zip had them all. Nobody in the public record can pinpoint the exact moment these two men met. But what is documented is the relationship that followed. According to multiple sources who knew both men, Von Zip became Uncle Zip to Sean Combs, advisor, protector, connector. Diddy would later stand at his funeral and say that Von Zip had saved his life. He never elaborated on what that meant. But the people who were in those rooms in the early 1990s, they knew. Let's talk about how wide that circle really was. Not as rumor, as documented fact. Von Zip Martin was the godfather to Christopher Wallace's son, the son of the man the world knew as the notorious B.I.G. This wasn't an honorary title. In Black American tradition, the godfather is the man you trust, above all others, to raise your child if you cannot. Biggie trusted Von Zip with his son's future. Von Zip was also the godfather to one of Diddy's children, two of the biggest names in hip-hop history, and both of them chose the same Harlem Street legend to stand as godfather to their sons. That's not coincidence. That's a level of trust that doesn't happen by accident. He managed Mike Tyson, the most feared boxer on the planet, in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The man who would bite off another man's ear in the ring and call it Tuesday. One of the people in Tyson's corner helping navigate the chaos of his career was Von Zip Martin. He co-executive produced the soundtrack for Exit Wounds, the 2001 film starring Steven Seagal and DMX. His name is in the credits. He worked alongside Jimmy Henchman, who ran Czar Entertainment, and Barry Hankerson, who ran Blackground Records. His nightclub hosted the book release party for Mamie Johnson, Bumpy Johnson's 93-year-old widow, when she published her memoir, Harlem Godfather, in 2008. Think about that. The widow of the original godfather of Harlem chose Von Zip's room for her book party. That's lineage. That's a passing of the torch. According to a journalist who knew him personally and spent nearly a decade interviewing him, Von Zip drove a bulletproof Mercedes. He maintained offices on both coasts. He moved effortlessly between entertainment and underworld circles in a way that very few men in American history have ever managed. He was, in the words of that journalist, following in the footsteps of his mentor, Bumpy Johnson. Semi-ruling Harlem's underworld on and off for decades. 1993, RT5, the East-West fault line. The rap game is exploding, and underneath the music there's a war building. Bad Boy Entertainment on the East Coast, Death Row Records on the West Coast, Diddy and Biggie on one side, Suge Knight and Tupac on the other. What starts as tension in lyrics becomes something harder and more real with every passing month. By 1995, it's not just beef, it's dangerous. Diddy needed security on the West Coast. He needed muscle he could trust in a city where he had enemies. According to investigators who would spend years trying to piece this together, Von Zip made a call. He had a relationship with the Southside Crips that went back nearly a decade. He knew who to call. He knew Keefe D., Dwayne Davis, a shot caller in the Southside Crips who had been moving product for Zip for years. According to investigator Greg Kading, who worked the Tupac and Biggie murder cases for the LAPD, the introduction between Diddy and the Southside Crips came through Von Zip Martin. The Crips began providing security for Bad Boy on the West Coast. It was a business arrangement at first, but in that world, business arrangements between people with guns have a way of becoming something more complicated. The Mike Tyson fight. Tyson versus Selden. MGM Grand, Las Vegas, Nevada. September 7th, 1996. Everybody was there. Suge Knight and Tupac were there. The Southside Crips were there. They flew in specifically for the fight. Von Zip Martin was there. He was with Foxy Brown at the MGM Grand that night. The same night, in that same building, one of Suge Knight's associates spotted Orlando Anderson in the lobby. Anderson was Southside Crips. Earlier that year, his crew had tried to rob a Death Row affiliate at a mall in Lakewood. Suge's people had not forgotten. A brawl broke out in the lobby. Tupac and Suge's crew jumped in. Anderson got beaten down on camera. The Crips crew, who according to investigators had come to Vegas unarmed, now had a problem. They needed a weapon. According to the murder rap documentary, based on LAPD Detective Greg Kading's investigation and Keefe D's own account, Von Zip Martin provided the weapon that night. Let me be precise here because precision matters. This is an allegation. It comes from Keefe D, who has since partially recanted his statements, and from a documentary based on that testimony. Von Zip was never charged. He was never indicted. He is not alive to respond. But here is what is not disputed. Von Zip Martin was present at the MGM Grand the night Tupac was shot. A few hours after that brawl, as Tupac and Suge Knight drove away from a post-fight event, a white BMW pulled alongside their car. Shots were fired. Tupac Shakur died 6 days later. And the man who investigators would spend years connecting to the weapon used in that murder was standing in that building when the night began. 6 months later, on March 9, 1997, in Los Angeles, Biggie Smalls, Christopher Wallace, had just performed at the Soul Train Music Awards. He was leaving a party at the Peterson Automotive Museum on Wilshire Boulevard. At the intersection of Wilshire and Fairfax, a dark-colored Chevrolet Impala pulled alongside his SUV. Shots were fired. Biggie was struck 4 times. He was pronounced dead at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center at 1:15 a.m. Von Zip was there. He was with Keyshawn Johnson, the NFL wide receiver, on Fairfax Avenue that night, blocks away in the vicinity when the most famous unsolved murder in hip-hop history happened. 2 nights, 2 murders, 2 of the greatest rappers who ever lived, one man present at both. That is not an accusation. That is a documented fact that investigators could not explain away. The LAPD noticed. 2009, 13 years after Tupac's murder. LAPD detectives were still working the case. Keefe D had been arrested on drug trafficking charges, and he had begun cooperating with investigators, offering information in exchange for consideration. What he told them was explosive. He said that Diddy had offered a $1 million bounty to kill Suge Knight and Tupac. He said $500,000 went to Von Zip Martin after Tupac's murder was carried out. Investigators needed to corroborate. They could not just take the word of a man trying to trade information for leniency. So they set up a sting. Keefe D flew to New York with LAPD detectives. The target was 2 people, Diddy and Von Zip Martin. They approached Von Zip outside his own nightclub, Zip Code, on Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard in the heart of Harlem. Keefe D asked him about product, testing the waters, trying to get a conversation started that investigators could use. Von Zip felt it. Something was off. He knew it in his gut, the way you know things when you have survived in that world for 40 years. He smiled. He was polite, and he never followed up. The sting produced nothing. Von Zip walked back inside his club, back to his world, and the Los Angeles Police Department went home with empty hands. 3 years later, cancer took what the police could not. Here's a question worth sitting with. Why doesn't anyone know this man's name? Not the way they know Bumpy Johnson, not the way they know Frank Lucas or Nicky Barnes, not the way they know the names Diddy put on albums and posters and magazine covers. Von Zip Martin spent 40 years at the center of Harlem's underworld. He was present at some of the most important events in both street history and music history. He was trusted by men who trusted nobody. He was godfather to children whose parents became cultural icons. And when you search his name, almost nothing, not because he wasn't important, because he was erased. The same journalist who spent a decade visiting him at Zip Code recalled asking Diddy's team a dozen questions about the relationship between the two men, about Von Zip's role in Bad Boy Entertainment, about what Uncle Zip had actually done for Sean Combs. Diddy's spokesperson sent back one sentence: "No comment." That was the sound of a powerful man with something to protect. Von Zip himself seemed to understand the irony. Sitting in his own club, over scotch, he once told that journalist something that stayed with him. He pointed to the 3,000 miles between New York and California. He said that journalist had made that trip to see him, and he said Puffy had never once walked through his door. He said it quietly, without anger, just a man taking stock of what loyalty actually meant in a world where loyalty was supposed to be everything. August 27, 2012. Von Zip Martin died of cancer. He was somewhere in his late 60s, and Harlem stopped. They dressed him in an impeccable suit. They put him in an ornate casket. They hitched that casket to a horse-drawn carriage, and they walked it through the streets of Harlem, past the clubs he'd owned, past the corners where he'd come up, past the building on 118th Street where it all started. Lil' Kim was there. Cameron was there. And then Diddy walked in, the man who had scrubbed Von Zip's name from every public record, who had never visited the club, who had moved on and up and left this Harlem OG behind like an inconvenient chapter in a story he'd rather not tell. He said some words. He called him Uncle. He said Von Zip saved his life. He didn't explain how. He didn't have to. The people in that room, the real ones, the ones who'd been there from the beginning, they already knew. Someone who watched it all unfold, someone who had known both men for years, summed it up afterward in a single sentence: his secrets die with him. What does it mean to be the most powerful man in the room, and also the most invisible? Von Zip Martin spent his life at the intersection of everything. He was the last link in a chain that ran from Bumpy Johnson's Harlem to Frank Lucas's Empire, to the first generation of hip-hop, to the most watched murder trial of the 2020s. Keefe D., whose given name is Dwayne Davis, was arrested in September 2023. He was indicted for the first-degree murder of Tupac Shakur, 27 years after the fact. His name was spoken in courtrooms, in depositions, in headlines around the world. And almost every time his name came up, another name appeared alongside it: Von Zippy, the man who introduced Keefe D. to Diddy, the man who allegedly ran product between the Southside Crips and Harlem for nearly a decade, the man who investigators believed supplied the weapon, the man who was in that building, the man who was on that street, the man who felt the sting coming and walked back inside his own club and lived free until cancer found him. There is a version of American history, the official version, the one with clean timelines and verified facts and the names that made it into movies, that does not include Von Zip Martin. And then there is the actual history, the one that happened in rooms where no cameras were allowed, in clubs that closed at 4 a.m., in conversations that were never recorded, and deals that were never signed. That history is full of men like Eric Martin, men who made everything possible and appeared in none of the credits. Here is what I want to leave you with. Two of the greatest hip-hop artists who ever lived are dead. Tupac Shakur. Christopher Wallace, gone before 30. For decades, no one was held accountable. Then in 2023, a 60-year-old man named Dwayne Davis was arrested in Henderson, Nevada. They found documents and evidence in his house. He was charged with murder. And in the legal filings that followed, the name Von Zip Martin appeared again and again. Zip was gone by then. He died 11 years before that arrest. The LAPD confirmed publicly that Diddy was never considered a suspect in Tupac's murder. Keefe D has recanted portions of his story. The full truth of what happened in Las Vegas in September 1996 may never be completely known, but this much is documented. There was a man who ran Harlem for 40 years, who built a supply network from coast to coast, who was trusted above all men by two of the most iconic figures in music history, who moved through the streets and the suites without leaving fingerprints, who felt a federal sting coming and walked away clean, who died before anyone could make him answer. His name was Eric von Zip Martin. He was born on 118th Street between 8th Avenue and St. Nicholas in Harlem, New York. And if you ask some people in that city, the real ones, the ones who were there, they will tell you something that makes the whole story land differently. They will tell you that Von Zip was not just following in Bumpy Johnson's footsteps. He was the next Bumpy. The last of a line that started before most of us were born and ended in an ornate casket rolling through the streets of Harlem on a horse-drawn carriage, while the man who owed him the most stood at a microphone and said as little as possible, "Rest in power to the ones who built it all and got none of the credit." And if you're new here, subscribe. There are 1,000 stories in this city that nobody's told yet. This was one of them. 1994, a courtroom in Los Angeles. A federal prosecutor stands before a jury and says something that nobody in that room has heard before. Not in those specific words, not with that specific documented evidence behind them. This is one of the first cases to establish a connection between Colombian cartels bringing enormous amounts of cocaine into this country and black gangs. One of the first. The jury convicted. The judge sentenced. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And the man at the center of it all, the man the prosecutor was describing, sat there the way he had always sat, calm, quiet. The way a man sits when he has known from the beginning that visibility is the one thing he could never afford. His name was Brian Bennett. The streets of South Central called him Waterhead Bo. And outside of South Central Los Angeles, nobody knew who he was. That was the point. Now go back 11 years earlier, somewhere in Los Angeles, 1983. A warehouse. Two men. One is Colombian, slim, well-dressed. His name is Mario Villabona Alvarado. He works for his uncle Oscar, the Cali cartel's principal representative in California. Behind Mario is the most powerful cocaine organization on earth. Billions of dollars, politicians on payroll, an operation so sophisticated that the United States government would spend decades trying to understand how it worked. The other man is 18 years old. He came from Michigan. His family moved to Los Angeles when he was a child. He was bused from South Central to the Valley for high school. Until 3 months ago, he was stocking shelves in a South Central supermarket. 18 years old, supermarket shelves. Mario looks at this teenager and sees something. Not a partner in the traditional sense, not a man with an organization already built, not a figure with a reputation that the streets of Los Angeles already knew. He sees a distribution problem solved. The price of cocaine in Los Angeles had just collapsed. $40,000 to $50,000 per kilogram 18 months earlier. Now $14,000 per kilogram. The Colombians had flooded the market so completely that the wholesale price had dropped through the floor. And a new product, crack cocaine, was about to sweep through the inner cities of America with a speed and devastation that nobody had fully anticipated. The Cali cartel needed someone to move product into the black neighborhoods of Los Angeles. Mario had been told specifically, find new customers for the crack cocaine sweeping the inner cities. He found this teenager. They shook hands, and that handshake, between a Colombian cartel representative and an 18-year-old from a South Central supermarket, set in motion a chain of events that would supply Los Angeles, supply Detroit, supply Chicago, supply Washington, D.C., supply Rayful Edmond, supply the biggest kingpin in South Central history, and ultimately fund the creation of the most famous rap label in the history of American music. His name was Brian Bennett. The streets called him Waterhead Bo, and he made sure that outside of South Central Los Angeles, nobody knew who he was. Brian Bennett made one decision that separated him from every other operator in South Central: stay invisible, not as a temporary tactic, not while he was building toward eventual visibility, permanently, by design, as the core operating principle of everything he built. He had watched what happened to men who announced themselves: the cars, the jewelry, the specific performance of wealth that the crack era demanded from the men who were generating it. Young operators all around South Central were buying Benzes and chains and letting the neighborhood know what they had, and then losing it to rivals who targeted visible wealth, to law enforcement who followed visible operators, to the specific mathematics of exposure that turns a successful drug organization into a federal indictment. Bo did none of it. He drove regular cars, dressed regular, moved through South Central like a man who had nothing to hide because nothing about his appearance suggested anything to find. Freeway Rick Ross was building his operation at the same time. Same product, same geography, same Colombian connections flowing through South Central. Freeway Rick was visible. His operation generated $600 million and an equal amount of law enforcement attention that eventually consumed everything he built. Bo watched that and moved differently. No flash, no announcement, no cars or jewelry that told the neighborhood what he was, just product, moving quietly, through operators he trusted, out to cities he had never set foot in: Detroit, Chicago, Memphis, Washington, D.C. The specific geography of Black America in the 1980s, cities connected by interstate highways and shared cultural networks, and the specific infrastructure of the underground economy that the crack era was building faster than anyone could track. Bo mapped all of it. He identified operators in each city who could receive product reliably and pay reliably and move without generating the kind of attention that would trace back to South Central. He built relationships, not through reputation, through results. Consistent product, consistent quality, consistent prices that made every operator in his network more profitable than they would have been sourcing through anyone else. That consistency was his signature, not his name, not his face, not his cars or his jewelry. His consistency. The Cali cartel had found the perfect distribution partner, a man who understood that in this business, the most dangerous thing you can do is let anyone know your name. By 1987, 4 years after the handshake with Mario in a Los Angeles warehouse, the scale of what Brian Bennett had built was documented by the federal government itself. In 1 month, just 1 month, Bennett purchased just under 1,000 kilograms of cocaine from his Colombian source. The Department of Justice Office of Inspector General documented it from law enforcement wiretaps. 1,000 kilograms, 1 month, one 23-year-old from South Central. Let that number sit for a moment. 1,000 kilograms is 2,200 pounds. At the wholesale price Mario was offering Bo, that is $14 million worth of cocaine flowing through Bennett's operation in 30 days. That is not a corner operation. That is not a neighborhood dealer scaling up. That is an industrial distribution network running at the scale of a legitimate import-export business, except the product was cocaine and the customers were drug organizations across Black America. 2,000 pounds flowing into California through Waterhead Bo's operation every single month. Moving from Mario's Cali cartel uncle through Bennett's distribution infrastructure and out to every major city in Black America. Detroit received product through couriers that Bennett sent specifically. Men who drove or flew product from Los Angeles into Michigan, where Detroit's drug economy was hungry for consistent quality product at prices that made the operation viable for the operators on the ground. Chicago, Memphis, cities across the South and Midwest, and Washington, D.C., where the product arrived in Crystal City, Virginia, was then cut at New York Avenue motels by members of Rayful Edmonds' organization and distributed to the Strip from 2 stash houses on Orleans Place and Morton Place Northeast. Rayful Edmond, the man 60 Minutes called the $300 million Kingpin, the man who supplied 60% of Washington, D.C.'s cocaine at his operation's peak, the man whose trial required anonymous juries because witnesses were too afraid to testify openly, the man who would eventually become the most infamous drug figure in D.C. history, was buying from Waterhead Bo, a 23-year-old from South Central Los Angeles, a man whose name Rayful Edmonds' customers on the D.C. Strip had never heard. That is the specific power of invisibility. Fritz had understood it in Harlem. Bumps Bassett had understood it in Queens. Bo had understood it in Los Angeles. The most powerful distribution network on the West Coast was being run by a man that nobody could point to. And Bo was also supplying someone closer to home, the most significant operator in South Central, the man who would use the money that Bo's cocaine generated to build something that changed American culture forever. Harry O. Michael Harris was from South Central, born and raised in the same geography that produced Waterhead Bo. The same streets, the same conditions, the same calculation that every young black man in South Central was making in the 1980s about what the legitimate economy was offering versus what the underground economy was generating. The streets called him Harry O. By the time he connected with Waterhead Bo, Harry O had already built something significant, an operation running cocaine across multiple states, connections to both the Bounty Hunter Bloods and the Rolling 60 Crips, the specific ability to move through both sides of the most dangerous gang divide in Los Angeles that almost nobody else had. That ability to operate with both the Bloods and the Crips simultaneously was Harry O's organizational genius. In a city where those two alliances were killing each other over blocks and colors and the specific territorial politics of South Central, Harry O had somehow made himself trusted on both sides. By age 26, Harry O was a millionaire, but Harry O understood something that separated him from most men in his position. Cash was temporary. What lasted was ownership. He watched the music industry the way a man watches a market he intends to enter. The specific sound emerging from South Central and Compton, the hip-hop that NWA was building, the street music that the mainstream industry hadn't yet recognized as the next American art form. Harry O saw it before anyone else with money saw it. He produced a Broadway play first. The play was called Checkmates. It featured Ruby Dee, Paul Winfield, and a young actor whose career was just beginning to build momentum, Denzel Washington. Harry O, the South Central cocaine kingpin, funded Denzel Washington's Broadway debut. The man who would become one of the most celebrated actors in American history had his first major stage production financed by a man running cocaine through the Bloods and the Crips of Los Angeles. And Harry O. wasn't done. In 1991, while sitting in federal prison, serving the 28-year sentence he received in 1987 for attempted murder and narcotics distribution, Harry O. received a visitor. Marion Suge Knight, a big man, imposing, connected to the mob Piru Bloods, a man with ambitions in the music industry that matched Harry O.'s own, a man who had been managing careers and building relationships in the Los Angeles music world, who saw what was coming in West Coast hip-hop the same way Harry O. had seen it, but who needed capital. $1.5 million in capital. Harry O. gave it to him. From inside a federal prison cell, through intermediaries, through the specific financial architecture that allows men inside federal facilities to move money to the outside world when they have the connections and the organizational intelligence to make it work. $1.5 million to start a record label. That label was called Godfather Entertainment. The world knows it as Death Row Records, Tupac Shakur, Snoop Dogg, Dr. Dre, the Dog Pound, the defining sound of West Coast hip-hop in the 1990s, the music that sold hundreds of millions of records, that defined an era, that appeared in movies and television shows and sporting events and became the soundtrack of an entire generation of American culture. All of it funded by Harry O. Harry O., whose operation was built on Bo's cocaine, the 18-year-old from the South Central supermarket, the man nobody outside Los Angeles knew. The trial produced a moment that the Assistant United States Attorney described as historic. It's very significant because it's one of the first to establish a connection between Colombian cartels bringing enormous amounts of cocaine into this country and black gangs. One of the first. In the entire history of American drug enforcement, Waterhead Bo's case was one of the first to produce a documented, prosecuted, legally established connection between a Colombian cocaine cartel and black street distribution networks. Not because the connection didn't exist before. It clearly did. Because Bo had operated so carefully, so invisibly, so precisely within the specific organizational structure that makes prosecution difficult, it took the federal government 3 years and a random traffic stop in Missouri to build a case that could survive a trial. Brian Waterhead Bo Bennett and Mario Villabona Alvarado, the two leaders of the operation, faced the consequence that the federal drug kingpin law mandated for men who built what they built. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, no cooperation deal, no reduced sentence, no testimony that would exchange years for freedom. Life. The 18-year-old who had shaken hands with a Colombian cartel representative in a Los Angeles warehouse in 1983, the young man who had stocked supermarket shelves 3 months before that handshake, received a sentence that meant he would spend the rest of his life in federal prison for an operation he built from nothing. That supplied Rayful Edmond in D.C. That supplied Harry O. in South Central. That funded Death Row Records from inside a prison cell. That changed American music history without anyone outside South Central knowing his name. 1988. Brian Bennett is not in Los Angeles. He is in Denmark, sitting with a woman, possibly his wife, in a Scandinavian country, thousands of miles from South Central, thousands of miles from Mario Villabona Alvarado, thousands of miles from the DEA agents who had been building their case against his operation for 3 years. Think about what that image represents. The man who had been stocking supermarket shelves in South Central 5 years earlier was now conducting international business from Denmark while his distribution network ran itself across 4 time zones. That is not luck. That is organizational architecture. He had built something so precisely structured, so carefully layered with trusted operators at every level, that the man at the top could be in Scandinavia and the product would still move from Los Angeles to Detroit, to Chicago, to Memphis, to Washington, D.C., without missing a beat. The invisibility that had been his strategy from the beginning had reached its logical conclusion. The most important cocaine distributor on the West Coast, a man the DEA had been watching for 3 years, was sitting in Denmark, unreachable, untraceable, operating through layers of insulation so thick that his own couriers in Detroit didn't know who gave the final order. He was orchestrating a deal, not a small deal, a massive transaction in Detroit. $5.4 million in cash seized near Detroit Metro Airport. 400 to 450 kilograms of Cali cocaine moving through a single transaction. One deal, one city. While Bo sat in Denmark, but 3 years of federal surveillance was about to close around everything he had built. The DEA had wiretaps, financial records, the documented flow of money and product through a network that connected a Cali cartel warehouse in California to Rayful Edmonds Strip in Washington, D.C., to stash houses across Black America. They had been watching since 1985, patient, methodical, building a case the way Bo had built his operation, carefully, layer by layer, without announcing themselves. In November 1988, on a highway in Missouri, a routine traffic stop. 2 couriers, 500 kilograms of cocaine in the car. Not a targeted stop, not a tip. Not the result of 3 years of DEA surveillance finally finding its moment. A state trooper on a Missouri highway pulling over a car for a routine traffic violation. 500 kilograms in the trunk. The thread that unraveled everything. Bennett and Villabona, under investigation for 3 years, monitored through wiretaps that had documented 1,000 kilograms in a single month, were arrested. The operation that had started with an 18-year-old stocking supermarket shelves was over. The trial produced a verdict that the Assistant United States Attorney described with the specific language of legal history. It is very significant because it is one of the first to establish a connection between Colombian cartels bringing enormous amounts of cocaine into this country and black gangs. One of the first, not the largest, not the most violent, not the most flamboyant. One of the first documented cases in American legal history of a direct operational connection between a Colombian cocaine cartel and black street distribution networks. Brian Waterhead Bo Bennett and Mario Villabona Alvarado, the 2 leaders of the operation, faced the consequence that the federal drug kingpin law mandated for men who built what they built. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. No cooperation deal. No reduced sentence. No path back. The 18-year-old who had shaken hands with a Colombian cartel representative in a Los Angeles warehouse in 1983, the young man who had stocked supermarket shelves 3 months before that handshake, received a sentence that meant he would never leave federal prison. The federal government's accounting of Brian Bennett measured what they could see: 1,000 kilograms in 1 month, 500 kilograms in Missouri, $5.4 million in Detroit, life without parole. What they never calculated, what the indictment and the sentencing and the legal history never fully captured, was the downstream consequence of what Bo built. Harry O. received his cocaine from Waterhead Bo. Harry O. funded Death Row Records. Death Row Records launched Tupac Shakur and Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre. Those 3 men alone generated billions of dollars in music revenue, changed the sound of American music, built the specific cultural architecture of West Coast hip-hop that still shapes music being made right now in 2024. The federal government sentenced Waterhead Bo to life in prison for what he did. They never sentenced anyone for what came after. The music, the culture, the billions of dollars generated by an industry that traces its West Coast roots to a $1.5 million investment that Harry O made from inside a federal prison cell, with money that came from cocaine that came from Waterhead Bo, the man nobody knows. Death Row Records generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. Tupac Shakur sold 75 million records, more than any other rapper in history. His music is still generating millions of dollars in streaming revenue every single year. His face is on murals across Los Angeles. His lyrics are quoted in courtrooms and classrooms and conversations that have nothing to do with the 1990s. Snoop Dogg became one of the most recognizable entertainers on earth. Movies, television, Super Bowl halftime shows, a global brand that has outlasted every other figure from that era. Dr. Dre built a production empire that eventually sold Beats headphones to Apple for $3 billion, the largest acquisition in Apple's history, $3 billion. From a man who started as a DJ in Compton, all of it traces back to Harry O. And Harry O's money, the specific capital that made Godfather Entertainment possible, that put $1.5 million in Suge Knight's hands in a prison visit in 1991, was built on cocaine. Cocaine that came from Waterhead Bo, 2,000 pounds at a time. Through a distribution network that connected a Cali cartel warehouse in Los Angeles to Rayful Edmonds Strip in Washington, D.C., to stash houses in Detroit and Chicago and Memphis. Built by an 18-year-old from a South Central supermarket, who understood from the beginning that the most dangerous thing he could do was become famous, who was in Denmark while his operation moved $5.4 million through Detroit, who made sure from the first handshake to the last deal that outside of South Central Los Angeles, nobody knew his name. The federal government knows it now. Life without parole. Harry O. was eventually pardoned by President Donald Trump in January 2021 after lobbying efforts by Snoop Dogg and criminal justice reform advocates. A man who had funded Death Row Records from a prison cell finally walked free. Suge Knight served time for manslaughter. Death Row Records went bankrupt. The label that changed American music was sold off in pieces. And Brian Waterhead Bo Bennett remains inside the federal prison system. The most important man in the chain that connected Colombian cocaine to the most famous rap label in history. The man who supplied Rayful Edmond while Rayful became DC's most famous kingpin. The man who supplied Harry O while Harry O funded Denzel Washington and Death Row Records. The man who sat in Denmark and moved $5.4 million through Detroit without leaving Scandinavia. The man nobody knows. Death Row Records is in the Smithsonian. Tupac's music is playing somewhere in the world right now. And somewhere in the federal prison system, Brian Bennett is still there. The man who supplied all of Los Angeles and made sure nobody knew his name.